Thank you. Me with Giulio Simeoni, we would like to also to thank you very much, our keynote speakers and the organizer. We are very happy to be here, in particular because we are here to learn. And I apologize for reading. I hope to be able to do it. Non c'è luce, ma pazienza. So, the state of the art concerning the third millennium in Western Caput Adria, or Friuli Venezia Giulia, didn't change a lot in the last decades. Most recent overviews, based on wide-ranging and updated approaches, mainly miss data from new contexts and materials useful for updating and precising chronological frameworks and cultural attributions. Substantial progress has been made on a macro scale, including the discussion of topics pertaining to neighboring regions and even the Adriatic, Mediterranean, and mainland European prehistory at large. A circumstance that gives us the opportunity to confront the archaeological evidence from Northern Adriatic on the background of both a number of fresh data and some wide-ranging explanatory patterns concerning major themes such as the fusion of the Cetina people, the cultural and chronological relationships between Ljubljana and Cetina styles, the contribution of Bell Beaker to the Copper Age, early Bronze Age transition. The reappraisal of some past proposals, such as that regarding the formative phase of the early Bronze Age with the emergence of Polada cultural elements, is also relevant in our perspective. Starting from these premises, we intend therefore to provide a framework to the discussion of available evidence as well as the evaluation of a very small number of new data with two main objectives: to explore the role of Northern Adriatic at the interface between the third millennium interlocking networks relating respectively to the Bell Beaker and the Balkan Adriatic cultural facies, and to comment on some evidence of change and transformation, hinting at a major discontinuity toward the late third millennium, possibly a consequence of the much debated crisis of the 4200 before present. Firstly, from a look at the distribution map of the late Copper Age or third millennium before Christ sites, including stray finds, it appears that northern Friuli, with an east-west oriented land strip cutting across the upper plain and the foothills of Piedmont, with some caves in eastern Friuli and a couple of settlements assemblages, such as possibly Ponte San Quirino to the east, Meduno Sacri Sotto to the west, was the most prominent area for east-west communication, including possibly the circulation of goods. As is well known, in the late Copper Age, Trieste Karst, with its caves, was central in the occupation dynamics of the Northern Adriatic, including participation in the Balkan networks fueled by Vucedol, Ljubljana, and Cetina agents. Now, very quickly, the history of research. Pettirosso and Ciclami caves have been inserted by Dimitrievich among the most relevant contexts of the Adriatischer Typus der Ljubljana Kultur, belonging to IG2, according to Paula and Josef Korzec. Blago Jegovedarica added to this group the Mitreo, Caterina, Kotariova, and Tartaruga caves, with deposits which would have represented an early phase of classic Ljubljana. Furtherly, he defined a later horizon, the so-called Ciclami Mitreo, which would have marked a kind of cultural devolution or decline of the Ljubljana culture. Ceramics from Mitreo, layer 4, best represented such horizon, including elements well-rooted in the previous Ljubljana tradition, as well as some Cetina-related and Transalpine components. This horizon, which would have coexisted with the Cetina in central Dalmatia, was datable, according to Govedarica, in the early Bronze Age, Bronzezeit A1 and A2, and would have followed the classical Ljubljana, datable up to the end of the second millennium. After the reappraisal and republication of many cave deposits by Emanuela Montagnari Cocchelli and colleagues, thorough revision of both the materials from the Karst caves and the Ljubljana context prompted a reassessment of the chronological framework with the context of Ljubljansko barrier, dated to 26th and 25th millennium by Elena Legissa, and the cultural aspects of Vucedol and Ljubljana Adriatic, substantially overlapping, mostly in the first half of the second millennium, according to Stasio Forenbayer, who lists circa 7 karst caves, including stylistical aspects belonging to Ljubljana, while Enna Leghissa considers circa 12 contexts, if I'm not wrong. Roughly the same caves, the best and most relevant are Mitreo, Cyclami, and Zingari, have been included in the list of contexts with materials belonging to Cetina by Forenbaer, who comprehends also a larger group of contexts attributable. Che succede? No, ecco. Attributable to Cetina-related pottery style. While influence from Ljubljana would have been impactful also out of the caves and karst environment, no further sites to the west of karst with typical decorated Cetina have been listed in the most updated surveys, such as that by Giulio Recchia. Attribution to the bell beaker cultural sphere have been also ambiguous and controversial. Beyond a few elements usually circulating also out of the proper bell beaker cultural sphere, as is the case of the wrist guard from the Cyclami cave, they concern a couple of metal items and a few ambiguous shards coming from caves and from the hill fort of Castellazzo di Doberdo, a major context in our perspective. Castellazzo, located in strategical positions at the western fringe of the karst, at the crossroads of coastal and inner routes, and overlooking a lake basin, experienced a long-time occupation starting well before the inception of the Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age Castellieri cultural facies, and rooted in the Copper Age according to a group of materials published some 30 years ago by Emanuela Montagnari Cocchelli. The lithic repertoire included both tanged and hollow-based arrowheads with rounded or squared barbs, encouraging the connection with the bell beaker cultural environment. Regarding pottery, the S-shaped, top links left, the S-shaped vessel referred to a bell beaker and decorated with rows of kind of notches is hardly comparable in the bell beaker repertoire of northern Italy. However, the decorative technique using incision and the loose organization of the decorative bands may be considered at home in several very late bell beaker assemblages, and even the fragments to the right, decorated with cursive incised motifs, including irregular triangles, which has also been referred to the bell beaker style, could find parallels in the very same late bell beaker context, possibly belonging to the early Bronze Age or a formative stage of the early Bronze Age, as well as to the evolved and epi bell beaker in Tuscany, in Toscana. A couple of shards in the third rows with patterns of hatched triangles and horizontal bands with vertical strokes, executed with barbelette technique, would be also consistent with an attribution to the bell beaker cultural sphere. The decorative technique, which is mainly being referred to the Ljubljana style, and considered one of the most effective markers of cultural interaction and mutual influence between Ljubljana and the bell beaker, is well attested now in several assemblages impacted by the bell beaker diffusion in northeastern Italy. More in particular, the technique is well attested in Ljubljansko barrier at Ig and Parte, on shapes typical of the Ljubljana repertoire, and on the Croatian coast at Varganatska Pećina, a site belonging to the classical Ljubljana for Govedarica and Ljubljana Adriatic for Forenbaer. In karst, the same technique has been reported in several caves such as Cotariova, Zingari, Cyclami, Mitreo, and at the hill fort of San Michele di Bagnoli. Several sites in Veneto, including Col Buson to the north and the Belluno area, and a number of settlements in the Verona area, offer evidence of barbelette decoration, a technique that should be dated in the second half or even the end of the third millennium, also according to the radiocarbon dates from Bongiovanna, Verona, as well as from the early phase of Lucone D in the pile-dwelling domain. Summing up, although we cannot definitely assume that the group of materials from Castellazzo, which doesn't come from systematic excavations, consists in a reliable association, the possibility that it represents a roughly homogeneous occupational phase seems convincing because it's the association itself, apart from single elements, to find significant parallels. In this regard, the contextual evidence of some angular or elbow-like handles recalling Pollada formal patterns is illuminating, as these components seem to have an important role in the definition of the very late bell beaker context in northern Italy, datable to the early Bronze Age, a chronology already proposed for Castellazzo by Montagnari. The association of elements relevant to the bell beaker tradition and the elbow-like handles, even including a button-like appendix like at Castellazzo, is recurrent in a few initial early Bronze Age alpine and subalpine contexts, such as Montecovolo and Lovere in Lombardia, and in the evolved and epi-bell beaker context in Toscana. In the Southern Alps, in Trentino, the site of Monte Sei di Serso includes, as is well known, a group of unstratified materials, some of them referring to Eastern Balkan styles, including Cetina, together with Pollada elements, which prompted Renato Perini to recognize a Pollada formative phase. Regarding Cetina, at Castellazzo, here top left, a small fragment with an incised triangle filled with impressed dots could find parallels in the Cetina-style pottery at Palagruja, as well as in the very few impressed and incised decorated pottery from the Kars caves, Mitreo and Zingari, but is also comparable in the bell beaker environment, such as at San Polo, Brescia. We can exclude, moreover, a Cetina connection for two fragments belonging to both decorated by means of impressed dots, as some possible parallels from Palagruja and, for instance, more to the south at Gaitan, Albania, could suggest, though they refer more probably to the Ljubljana Adriatic style according to the attribution by Forenbacher. If the materials from Castellazzo are internally coherent and really consistent with the formative phase of the early Bronze Age, to be dated in the last century of the third millennium, the association with the Ljubljana Adriatic style could result problematic. Obviously, we cannot exclude that the site had been occupied for a longer period, starting towards the mid-third millennium, and with a more stable occupation at the beginning of the early Bronze Age, as specified by the core of the available evidence. We feel, however, legitimate to propose that patterns depending upon the Ljubljana style would have been still impactful on later production, as is the case with the Barbelé technique. The formal repertoire of later styles would have appropriated patterns belonging to earlier traditions. Some curious elements, here at the bottom of the slide, such as the fragment of an S-shaped vessel decorated with horizontal bands formed by double rows of large impressed dots, could point to a phenomenon of hybridization involving the bell beaker and the Ljubljana Cetina cultural components. A few pieces of evidence from sites not far from Castellazzo, located in the same geographical area of the Isonzo Basin, namely the eastern Friuli Plain, could be also referred to agents of impressed incised pottery, possibly operating at the dawn of the early Bronze Age. A very small fine fragment from Visco, an open lowland settlement in the wet environment of mid-eastern Friuli, presents a decoration with impressed dots forming triangles. Both technique and decorative style find parallels in Ljubljana as well as in the Cetina pottery assemblages. Roughly comparable with the fragment from Castellazzo, the piece from Visco distinguishes itself for the lack of incised edges and the thicker or denser distribution of dots, which permit us to take into consideration also parallels in the late bell beaker or early Bronze Age assemblages impacted by bell beaker tradition, a connection that can be farthily supported by the vessel shapes, probably a deep bowl or S-shaped bowl. We can mention parallels at Monte Sei di Serso and at Trescore Balneario, as well as in the epi bell beaker assemblages in Toscana. Though the fragment doesn't have a stratigraphical context, its association with a pottery representing the most ancient occupation or the foundation of this long-term settlement seems highly probable. Once more, we are prompted to ascertain the association of the incised impressed pottery style rooted in the third millennium with early Bronze Age pottery represented by angular or elbow-like handles, and possibly a more complex set of pottery referable to early Polada. Slightly northward, along the same river bed of the river Torre at Nogaredo, a large group of pottery from surface collection recently published by Paola Visentini included a fragment of incised and impressed pottery with multiple bands of incised lines filled with triple rows of elongated impressions forming complex angular patterns. The fragment, which has been coached to the ascribed Zetina, finds parallels, albeit imprecise, both in the Adriatic at Palagruja and the Alps at Monte Sei di Serso. Independently from the precise cultural attribution, the commented evidence seems meaningful as it clearly stresses the importance of the western karst or the territory of Gorizia and the Isonzo Valley, which, representing the narrowest strip of land between the coast and the mountains in northern Adriatic, played a substantial role in the interregional communication, particularly connecting the coast and the eastern karst to the Piedmont and the Alpine valleys. It's therefore worth mentioning that in a couple of sites along the Piedmont, the association with Stetina has been claimed for a couple of undecorated vessels, or possibly undecorated vessels, such as a beaker from Gemona, with formal parallels in the karst caves, and the necked vessel or beaker from Pinzano e Tagliamento. Turning now to the stray finds, including metals, the overlapping interest of Balkans and bell beaker cultural components in northern Adriatic can be exemplified by a few items such as a dagger and a couple of axes. As is well known, the two shaft-hole axes from Friuli point to a Balkan Carpatic cultural environment. The provenience of the items, respectively from the San Daniele in the upper hilly area of Friuli and from Aquileia, fits well with the pattern emphasized by the pottery distribution, showing that the most relevant areas for interregional communication consisted in the coastal plain of eastern Friuli and the Isonzo Basin and the Piedmont Strip. The two axes belong to the typological group Dumbraiovara, most probably dating to the second half of the last century of the third millennium. Though their distribution includes several exemplars from northern Italy with Veneto, Trentino, Lombardia, they clearly depend upon a Balkan ancestry going back to the Vucedol metallurgical industry. The widespread diffusion of shaft-hole axes around the Alps, including various types and even hordes of multiple items, together with the evidence of local production in several inner Alpine sites, from Ljubljansko Barje to Monte Sei di Serso, including the evidence at Pigloner Kopf Vadena, seems to point to the use of this class of items as a kind of brand or a standard of value in metal exchange, prompted by a dominant Balkan Carpathian agency. It's also worth underlining that, as Joseph Maran had brilliantly argued, in the symbolic communications, the shaft-hole axes represent the most powerful weapon or tool of the southeastern European elite emergent in the third millennium. It was therefore an exclusive prestigious symbol of power, able to compete with a dagger, most diffused in other Mediterranean European regions, including the bell beaker cultural environments. It's therefore all the more intriguing that a copper-tanked dagger, possibly belonging to the Cempezuelos type, well representing the European bell beaker cultural assemblages, has been found near Aquileia. Among the new Italian exemplars from Sardinia and northeastern Italy, the dagger from Santa Cristina di Fiesse is particularly significant. In this site, we find also the best parallel for a flat axe with expanded blade, the next one, from Aquileia, the next one, precisely belonging to the Santa Cristina type. Putting the pieces together at the end of this survey, we may provisionally conclude, underlining that the northern Adriatic regions, and in particular the western part of Caput Adria, were certainly involved in the interaction between the eastern and western third millennium cultural spheres or networks, possibly with a role of transit area or buffer zone, where the dominant agency was mainly represented by Eastern Balkan components pertaining to the Vuccedo-Ljubljana cultural groups. This agency was mainly active through a pattern of land mobility across the alpine and subalpine routes connecting the Ljubljana Basin and the karst to the Southern Alps. Substantial evidence of the expansion of a Balkan component to the west include the Vucedol ceramics from Colbuson in Veneto and some metal evidence such as the typical Ig holes and the moods for shaft hole axes, demonstrating, in our opinion, ideological dominance of the Balkan components within a dynamic of westward expansion, possibly in coincidence with the start of metal exploitation in Southern Alps. We cannot rule out the possibility that Vuccedo-Ljubljana agents played a role in the transfer of technological know-how in both production and circulation of metals. Some change seemed to have intervened in the very end of the late third millennium, when a Western component spreading late Belgica cultural features is first attested in the Caput Adria, so it appears blended and possibly hybridized with Eastern components related to the Ljubljana Cetina tradition. It is possible that starting this phase, a local agency participated in the interregional interaction, as some evidence from new founded settlement, such as possibly Castellazzo and Visco, could suggest. The connecting routes remained possibly the same as before, which served the main land mobility. Some evidence, however, such as the metal items from Aquileia, could indicate the foundation of a landing place for maritime mobility in Eastern Friuli. While we feel legitimate to propose that the Belgica component, albeit tenuous and ambiguous, could have filled the void caused by the diminishing expanding power of the Ljubljana agency, the actual role of Cetina agents is hard to outline. The scanty evidence related to Cetina and Friuli Venezia Giulia, including the karst caves consisting of a great deal of possibly undecorated vessels and a few roughly decorated ceramics through incision and impressed triangles, seem to be still connected to a previous Ljubljana tradition, including transalpine components, while finds only scanty parallels in the repertoire of intensively decorated pottery from central Dalmatia. While some Cetina agents living from the karst caves could have followed the route open in the previous period, mainly directed to the alpine mineral districts, no clear evidence exists thus far for proving a connection via the Friuli coastal plain between the karst and the possible distribution of Cetina-related pottery in Western Adriatic. Turning briefly to our second objective, discontinuity, it's worth observing that a major change seems to have involved somewhere in the late third millennium the settlement pattern of Friuli, possibly after a gap. The few stable long-term sites, such as Meduno Sacri Sotto, were then abandoned. Few others were possibly founded, while instability and mobility seem to have mainly affected the way of life. This could be exemplified by the hamlet of Flaibano, in the upper Friuli plain near the river Tagliamento. There, two isolated houses, one built on top of the other, seem to testify in extremely scattered settlement patterns, possibly affected by frequent shifting and change of location. It is worth observing that the material assemblage of the upper house is mainly related to transalpine cultural components, particularly belonging to the Ogau-Wiffing and Somogi-Valvinkovci cultural facies, datable between 2005 or 400 and 2200, or, according to a finer chronological attribution, to Proto-Nietids, Bronzezeit Null, or the 23rd millennium before Christ. The evidence point out that instability of seats and the mobility of people in the years around 4200, contextually or immediately before the foundation of new sites such as Visco, in newly selected well-watered locations. We cannot therefore rule out the possibility that the archaeological visibility of the few agents of late impressed and incised pottery style, such as Cetina or the BB or the Belgica in our region, is due to a resilient strategy implying settling down and assimilation in local communities, according to a pattern that on a completely different scale has been put forward also in other regions more to the south. Thank you very much.